want to welcome you to our class this evening. I'm glad that you're here. It's been a wonderful day. For those of you that are arriving here recently, just in the last few minutes, there was a baptism a few minutes ago. Caden Morton was baptized. His dad, Justin, baptized him into Christ. So it was a great afternoon for the Morton family and for us here at Walter Hill. So if you see Caden, make sure you congratulate him upon that wonderful decision that he made. So I heard someone was saying that our baptistry is getting used out quite a bit, and was hoping the lessons this week would have prompted some baptisms, and there have been 3 since last Sunday. So the lesson Justin has been bringing us, they've been good lessons, and make sure you say a word of thanks and gratitude for him for those. Tonight we're going to continue in our study, A Lifetime of Service. And tonight's lesson, as you can see on the screen, is talking about Ruth, a lifetime of devotion. We're looking at different ones in the Bible and different character traits that just sort of stand out a little bit. And so tonight we're going to take a look at Ruth. And of all the women in the Bible, Ruth is probably, if not my favorite, very close to being my favorite woman in the Bible. As we have asked in previous classes about the person we're studying, where can Ruth be found in the Bible? What books? Book of Ruth, yeah. Where's the other one?
Esther.
Matthew, mentioning the genealogy of Jesus. So she is mentioned by name, and that speaks very well of her. Ruth is one of 5 women mentioned in Matthew's account of the genealogy of Jesus. Can you name the other 4? Tamar, Rahab, Splash, she was taking a bath. Bathsheba, and then Mary, of course, the mother of Jesus. So those are the 5 women that are mentioned in Matthew's account in the genealogy of Jesus. Ruth is a story of both a geographical journey and of a personal journey. So when did the story of Ruth take place? During the Judges. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, in verse 1 of Ruth. And after the death of Joshua, God raised up judges to lead Israel. It is uncertain which judge or judges were ruling during the days of Ruth. There's some speculation that might have been one or another, but it's really not known. We do know that many of the judges that God raised up did not do what God wanted them to do. And they were rebellious, they were sinful, they led the people astray. And as you know, there was a cycle that, and we won't get too far off in Judges, but of where, they were oppressed and God would raise up a judge, the people would repent, and then they fall away again. So what was the moral state of Israel in the days of Ruth? Most likely it wasn't too good. Likely Israel was morally corrupt, both socially and spiritually. The description of Israel in Judges 21, verse 25, goes on to tell us, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And whether it was in the days of Ruth or Jesus or even in the world today, when it can be said that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, there would be problems in society. You can see it then. You probably can see it now in many places. And even with the corruption that was rampant in Ruth's days, there remains some godly people. And Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, I think you could cite those as three godly people that were not doing what was right in their own eyes. They were doing what they knew to follow God. And so there's always exceptions. When it said everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes, sometimes that's a generalization and not an absolute that everyone was doing it. And you can see that in other instances in Scripture too, where it might say all or everyone. There were certainly exceptions to that. So in the beginning of the book of Ruth, we read that there was a famine in Israel. In the Bible, famines were sometimes caused by natural occurrences, and sometimes God used famines to punish his people. And it's no indication that the famine mentioned in Ruth 1 was as a result of evil on the part of the people, although considering the times that it was, he could have been using that famine as punishment, but it could have been a natural occurrence as well. And because of the famine, the story of Ruth takes place in two countries. In what two locations provide the setting for the book of Ruth?
Moab and Bethlehem.
Yeah, Moab and Bethlehem, that's correct. Bethlehem being part of Judah, being part of Israel. It was all one Israel at that time. Bethlehem is in Israel, just a few miles west of the Dead Sea. Not too very far from it, or the Jordan River. Moab was on the east side of the Dead Sea, and Israel and Moab bordered together. And it was a 3 or 4 day journey by foot that separated Bethlehem and Moab, so it wasn't as long of a trek as what Abraham had to make to go from Ur to Canaan. I mean, very short walk compared to that. If you were to do it by car, you could probably get there in 3 or 4 hours after you got through all the border checks and all that. This map here shows them, speculates that they went to the north side of the Dead Sea, crossing over the Jordan River just north of the Dead Sea, and then coming down into Moab. Very mountainous, very hilly country. The Ammonites were up north. The tribe of Reuben was just north of Moab. So, and they could have gone that way, but there's no way to know for certain. But regardless of their close proximity to each other, Israel and Moab were like day and night. They didn't like each other. And there was bad history between the two countries. But when you need to feed your family like Elimelech needed to feed his, you do things and go places you probably wouldn't ordinarily go. So as we get into the heart of the lesson today, we're going to talk about some different aspects of Ruth's devotion. The first one we're going to talk to is her devotion to her husband, Mahlon. The book of Ruth opens to Elimelech, and I'll probably get that twisted around a lot tonight. It opens up to Elimelech and his wife Naomi taking their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to Moab because of the famine in Israel. It's likely that the 2 sons were adults, probably young adults, when they made their move, or at least they were pretty close to marrying age. And it is what sometimes people would call a perfect family, a father, a mother, 2 children. But that didn't last for long. Calamity struck. And Elimelech, the father, he died, leaving a wife and 2 unmarried sons to fend for themselves. It's not known how long they were in Moab before he died, but it would have been a difficult life for Naomi and those 2 sons in a foreign country. And I don't know why they didn't return to Israel. Perhaps the famine was still ongoing and they knew that if they returned, there still was no food for them to eat. But for whatever reason, they didn't return to Israel at that time. In verse 4 of Ruth of chapter 1, we find Mahlon and Chilion both taking wives from Moab. And their names was Orpah and Ruth. How long does Scripture say that they were married? Really don't know. We know that they were in Moab for 10 years, but we don't know how long they were in Moab before they married their wives, and so that's a little unclear as well. But likely close to 10 years. And then tragedy struck Naomi again as both of her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they also died. And they left behind a childless widow and a mother with no grandchildren. It was a terrible course of events for Naomi and Orpah and Ruth. For Orpah and Ruth, they had married foreigners instead of men of their own country. You know, it's quite likely there could have been some type of stigma attached to them, marrying Israelites because of the hatred that they had between Moab and Israel. Friends and family may have looked at them a little differently. You know, what were you thinking? What were you doing? And they might have even whispered that the reason for not having children was because the gods of the Moabites was punishing them for marrying these Israelite men. Still, they remained faithful and devoted to their husbands, and Ruth chose to remain with her Israelite husband Mahlon despite the inability to have children. We'll move over to Ruth's devotion to Naomi. It's something that you can see throughout the book of Ruth. Mothers-in-laws often have a less than desirable reputation. On television comedies, they are frequently cast in poor light, being portrayed sometimes as being overbearing or nosy. On game shows, mother-in-law questions pop up from time to time. Questions like, if you were stranded abandoned on a deserted island with your mother-in-law, what would you do? Yep, that's the reaction the audience gives, Stan. Yeah, there's a chuckle in the audience. But you know, in reality, many families have a great in-law relationship. And because if you didn't amen, she'd let you know later. But truly, you know, many families have good relationship. Shirley is more like a daughter to my mother than a daughter-in-law, and Shirley treats my mother just like it was her own mother. And, you know, someday Shirley and I are going to be next-door neighbors with my parents until the Lord returns. And we have cemetery plots right next to them. So, and she didn't mind that. Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law, Naomi, as I've mentioned, is seen throughout the book of Ruth. And after the deaths of her husband and 2 sons, Naomi decided it would be best for her to return to Bethlehem. Verse 6 tells us that the famine had ended in Judah and food was available again, and Bethlehem was home to Naomi. She still had friends and neighbors that were living there, and she decided it was time to go. There was nothing left for her to do in Moab. The daughters had no husbands. She had no grandchildren. She might as well live out her last days in Bethlehem. She returned a broken woman, but she kept hold of her deep faith in God. And she was a very broken woman. And although Naomi probably intended to make the trip to Bethlehem alone, Orpah and Ruth followed along with her. And not only does this show their devotion to Naomi for being with her on this trip back to Bethlehem, it also is an indication of their devotion to their husbands in desiring to take care of an aging, heartbroken mother-in-law. But as they approached the land of Judah, what did Naomi encourage Orpah and Ruth to do? Go home. Go home to your families. And Ruth 1:8 says, "But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return of each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Here Naomi acknowledges their kindness and their devotions to their husbands and her. So why then would Ruth encourage them to return home? Well, she realized that their prospects for getting a husband in Israel probably wasn't great. She knew that she was too old to have children, and even if she could, and had a son, with these two women that were probably in their mid-20s at this time, would they wait for that infant son to grow up to marry them? And we'll talk about that. That sounds sort of gross, but we'll talk about that levirate marriage a little bit later in the class. But okay, Orpah accepted the advice of Naomi. She returned to Moab. Verse 6 says she returned to her gods, and which is what Ruth instructed her to do. Ruth, however, was not willing to leave Naomi. In one of the most beloved passages in Scripture, Ruth makes her plea to stay with Naomi. Ruth chapter 1, 16 and 17. "But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you judge, I will judge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death departs me from you." Now here Ruth is talking to Naomi. Where do you most commonly hear this passage today? Weddings. And I don't know if it's used as much today in weddings as it used to be. I know it was a big thing at the time that I was getting married, but it was read a lot at weddings. And but understanding all the downsides of going to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law Ruth, was determined to stay with Naomi. She had no husband, no children, little prospect of having a second husband. Ruth's husband, Mahlon, had died in Moab, but Ruth would die in Bethlehem with Naomi. Mahlon was buried in Moab, but Ruth would be buried with her mother-in-law. Ruth didn't make a fleeting decision. It wasn't something that she just did on the spur of the moment. She was determined that she wanted to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Ruth's devotion to Naomi did not end upon their arrival in Bethlehem. Just because the famine was over didn't mean that Uber Eats or Kroger or Walmart was going to deliver food to their house. They were going to have to go out and get it. And it was theirs to get, but they still had to make some effort to go get food. So Ruth, being the younger one, took it upon herself to go glean the fields. Now, what was gleaning the fields? Yes, they could go pick what was left after the harvesters, after the landowners' workers had gone through and collected the crops. There was always going to be a little bit left behind. And why would a landowner leave some of his crops behind? Why not take it all? It was part of the law. That's exactly right. And you can find that in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. "When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands." So who was allowed to glean the fields? The sojourner or the foreigner? the fatherless, and the widow. Why them?
They had no one else to provide for them.
Yeah, generally they were the poorest of the poor and had no means. They couldn't be landowners. You know, they probably didn't have the money to buy food. And so Ruth, we find, is doubly qualified to glean. Not only was she a widow, she was a foreigner as well. And so she certainly had the right to glean in the fields of the landowners there. And a landowner such as Boaz provided welfare assistance for the poor, but more importantly, served God by allowing the less fortunate to glean in his fields. In return, Deuteronomy states that God would bless the landowner and all the works of his hands. Landowner, if you want to be blessed, you're going to take care of the poor that are in your area. And Boaz, he heeded the law that God had set out. So this is where we find Ruth in chapter 2, gleaning the fields of Boaz. Ruth gleaned the fields so she and Naomi could eat and survive. In another passage found in chapter 2, there is a conversation between Ruth and Boaz. I'm going to read verses 8 through 13 of chapter 2. And so it goes, Then Boaz said to Ruth, Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Listen to verse 11. But Boaz answered her, All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward will be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, although I am not one of your servants. And so we see from verse 11 that Ruth's devotion to Naomi was well known in Bethlehem. The town may have even pitied Naomi and her sad situation. No husband, no grandchildren, no children, a daughter-in-law that some could have initially looked at as being an anchor instead of a help, an aid. But they admired Ruth for taking care of Naomi. Whatever the case, Ruth's devotion to Naomi had been brought to the attention of Boaz, and for that she obtained his favor in gleaning his fields and sharing the reapers' food and water and receiving protection. At the end of the book of Ruth, we see another affirmation of Ruth's devotion to Naomi after Ruth gives birth to a son by Boaz. And the community, in speaking to Naomi, says in Ruth 4:15, He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. The community let Naomi know what a value, what a benefit Ruth was to her. Of course, I suspect Ruth already was aware of that, but to have the community acknowledge that would have caused the pride in Ruth to swell up, and pride in a good way. Next, we're going to talk about Ruth's devotion to Israel. Ruth was a Moabite, and her parents were Moabites. Essentially, nothing is known about Ruth in her childhood years other than that she had been born a Moabite. We'll talk about the religious aspect in Ruth's life in a few minutes, but the cultural differences between Moab and Israel would have been apparent. In marrying Mahlon, an Israelite, she would have had to make some changes in her life. If she was going to be a good wife, a faithful wife. The dietary laws of Moab would have been different than those of Israel. You know, if you've moved here from another country, you grew up in another country and you moved here, we celebrate some holidays that you probably didn't celebrate from your home country. And there would have been other differences that you would have noticed about the United States compared to other parts of the world. When we were in Egypt, when they had on the menu stuffed pigeon, thought, no, I don't think so. And there were some other things that they had on the menu that I thought, no, I don't think about that either. Richie, have you ever had a stuffed pigeon? No. Do many of y'all eat tilapia?
Oh, yeah.
Many places in South America, they consider that a trash food. They catch one, they throw it away. They don't like them. I don't know. Different things for different people. Sidetracked. When Ruth left Moab and Naomi and headed to Bethlehem, she permanently left behind those things she had known since her youth. In Ruth 1, verse 16, Ruth tells Naomi that your people shall be my people. If your people are the people of Israel, they're going to be my people. When she moved to Israel, she took into account the laws of the land and followed those. Ruth never looked back as far as we know. Israel was her future. And several times in the book of Ruth, she is fully identified as Ruth the Moabitess. In today's time, putting that tagline on a person would sometimes be viewed as a slur or prejudicial. There's no indication that was the case with Ruth. It certainly did not affect Boaz's desire for her. Can you think of another woman in the Bible that was also given a tagline that certainly would be an outrageous slur today? Rahab the harlot. I don't think you'd go up to any woman and say, whatever the harlot. You'd probably get slugged. And if her husband was close by, her boyfriend, I know you get slugged. But Ruth the Moabitess. Whatever the people, particularly the women in Bethlehem, initially thought of Ruth when she first arrived in Bethlehem, they came to accept her as one of their own. In their eyes, yes, she was a Moabite, but now she's an Israelite. And her devotion to Israel is apparent. All right, next we'll talk about her devotion to Boaz. Ruth 4:13 records that Boaz became the second husband of Ruth and fathered a son by her. Verse 13 says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. That had to be quite a risk because she didn't have any children by Mahlon. We don't know why she didn't have children by Mahlon, but apparently it wasn't Ruth because she could have a child by Boaz. Either that or God, in his plan, decided to shut her womb while she was Mahlon and opened it when she was married to Boaz. So what else do we know about Boaz? Yes, he's in the genealogy of Jesus. He was part of the clan or the family of Elimelech. He was a landowner and a man of some wealth, that he had employees, he had fields, he had property, and all that.
Wasn't he a relative of Naomi's husband?
Yes, yeah, Elimelech. Yeah, he was a relative of Naomi's husband. And who was his most famous great-grandson? David. And you can find that genealogy towards the end of the book of Ruth. And you can see it also in Matthew. So who was Boaz's mother? Rahab. Rahab the harlot was the second mother-in-law to Ruth. And in the genealogy of Jesus listed in Matthew 1, Matthew writes, and Solomon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king. You know, knowing that Rahab was the mother of Boaz might give us a little more insight into why Boaz might be attracted to Ruth. Rahab was what? Was she a natural-born Israelite? No, she was a Canaanite. And so who, like Ruth, had become a faithful follower of God Jehovah. Boaz would have learned and understood what it was like to leave family and nation to follow God and become part of the nation of Israel. Rahab's not mentioned in the book of Ruth. Boaz probably was an older man. Rahab probably had died before Ruth and Naomi came to Bethlehem. And the kindness and generosity Boaz showed to people in general, and the Ruth in particular, endeared her to him. Boaz had warned his young male employees, hands off, don't touch her, don't go after her, and not to insult her. He says he invited her to eat at his table. He allowed her to work alongside the harvesters, harvesting the best of the crops, just not the scraps that were left over. And you can see why Ruth was so endeared to Boaz. He treated her like a queen. And generally, not always, when it comes to a marriage proposal, it's usually the man that proposes to the woman. That wasn't the case here. We find that Ruth proposed to Boaz. And telling Naomi about the day she had had it in the fields of Boaz and how well Boaz had treated her, Naomi quickly realized that this may provide the future she had hoped Ruth would have. Boaz was a close relative of Elimelech, her husband, and Naomi pointed to the Israelite law of levirate marriage. So what is the law of levirate marriage?
Someone dies without heir. His widow would be able to marry the first of his brothers or down the line so that she might have seed to his generation.
Yeah, let's take a look at that passage in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife. If you need the Lord's Supper, it's available down the hall, and someone should be there to assist you. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. So although the son would be sired at birth by the brother, it would go to her first husband. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, Then his brother's wife shall go to the gate of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who has his sandal pulled off. Sounds a little strange, doesn't it, Bill? So, and this sounds sort of repugnant to us. If your husband dies, that you become the wife of the brother. But it was very important in the Israelite world. And then in Deuteronomy, it mentions a levirate marriage as a requirement for the brother of the deceased husband. But in Ruth's case, Boaz was not a brother of Elimelech. Boaz might not have been required to take Ruth as his wife, but he willingly chose to do so. And Boaz could have declared, and Deuteronomy only applies to Israelites, not Moabites or other foreign peoples. And Boaz could have declared that he was not even interested in a foreign woman. But Ruth chapter 3, verses 8 and 9 records Ruth's proposal to Boaz. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. That's a little strange too. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. She was telling him that, listen, you're qualified to take me as a wife. And Boaz could have rejected Ruth's proposal, but he didn't. He then bestowed a blessing on her, and this blessing amplified his belief that God was involved in bringing about this marriage proposal. Next, he notes the kindness Ruth had in choosing him over a younger man. Ruth could have chased after men closer to her age, but she chose to follow this levirate law and seek out Boaz, a family member. So it didn't take long for Boaz to respond to Ruth, telling her in verse 11, I will do for you all that you ask. And as you're probably aware, maybe aware, there was still a hurdle to overcome because it was the closest relative to her dead husband. That was not Boaz. There was another one. His name is not known, but before Boaz could say, I'm going to take you as my wife, he had to make sure that the other close relative didn't also want to do the same thing. Chapter 4 talks of Boaz's offer to that closer relative to buy Naomi's property. And this unnamed relative, he said, yes, I'll take the land. And then when he realized Naomi and Ruth also came with the deal and he would have to take them as well and Ruth as a wife, he said, never mind. And he quickly backed off, making the way for Boaz to marry Ruth. And I find the declaration of the people who witnessed the transaction between Boaz and the other relative quite interesting. 4:11 says, Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. The people of Bethlehem asked the Lord to bless that marriage with children. And to put Boaz and Ruth, particularly Ruth, in the same light as Rachel and Leah, who were the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel, that's putting this woman Ruth on a very high pedestal, and deservedly so. All right. The last one we're going to do is her devotion to God, and we'll try to get through this in the next 5 minutes. Think we can do it. Ruth 1:5 gives us a little hint about Ruth's background. And this is Naomi talking to Ruth, and she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Throughout the history of the Old Testament, foreign women had always been a snare to the men of Israel and leading them astray. Instead of these Israelite men being strong spiritually, they succumbed to the gods of their wives. Can you think of some other Old Testament men who married foreign women?
Solomon.
Solomon.
Supposedly the wisest of the wise, and he still was snared by them.
That's exactly right. Samson. Yeah.
Multiple kings of
Yeah, a lot of the kings, strayed that way. I think of Esau. Although technically Israel was not a nation at that point, but where that was going. But Esau, he did that too, and there's many others that you could refer to. The indication is that Ruth and her family worshiped the gods of the Moabites, not God Jehovah. That seemed to be the case with Orpah, and it was probably the case with Ruth as well. And God had given commandments for the people of Israel, men and women, not to intermarry with the Canaanites or with the people in neighboring nations. So we talked about the temptation to worship false gods. God wanted his people to remain faithful and devoted to him, as that was and is the only way to be reconciled to him. We don't know if Ruth had fully rejected the gods of the Moabites at the time she married Mahlon. She would have had godly influences in her life with Elimelech and her husband, and with Naomi for sure. We can see that she became fully devoted to God when she neared Bethlehem. Chapter 1:16 says, "And your people shall be my people, and your God my God. I'm forsaken the gods of the Moabites." And the people of Bethlehem recognized that she believed in the one true God. Chapter 4:11 says, "Then all the people who were at the gate and elders said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem.'" Asking God to make Ruth to be like Rachel and Leah. What a great testament to her, a woman truly devoted to God. God did and can work through the lives of the most ordinary people. And there was nothing special about Ruth, but she became special. She's going to be remembered throughout the ages for her love and her devotion. And God's hand is revealed throughout the book of Ruth, and we are blessed because of it. So that's class for tonight. Thank you for being here. Next Sunday night is our gospel meeting. Is this coming weekend, Friday night through Sunday. Not next Sunday night. We won't have class in the evening. But after our morning worship next Sunday, we'll have a Bible class. It will be a combined class taught by Dan Chambers. I'm here in the auditorium for the adults. The children will go to their classes, so be prepared to stay after worship next Sunday for the Bible class, and then you'll be dismissed for the day. Thank you for being here tonight.